Now, they always say that a bad workman can blame his tools, and we want to try and make sure that your golf clubs can't possibly hold any excuses for the reason why you're not reaching your potential when you play. So very quickly, I'm just going to talk you through what I have in my bag and what sort of parallels you might be able to draw into the clubs that you have in your bag. So, starting with the driver. Now, driver technology has moved on quite a lot in the last few years, and probably the driver technology is moving on quite a good pace now. So nearly every 3 or 4 years, I mean every year, the manufacturers will tell you that they've added 20 yards to your game. Well, that's not quite true. I would say every 3 or 4 years there would be a slight yardage increase, but it is nowhere near as much as the marketing guys and the manufacturers would tell you it is. So I would suggest that the driver, you probably review the driver every 3 or 4 years. Now, the most important thing with the driver is not necessarily buying the latest one off the shelf or the one that your mate has, but he's actually getting the one that's the right spec and the one that's the right fit for yourself. There's an awful lot of loft changes that can be made to a driver, a lot of shaft length and also shaft flex changes, which we'll get back to in a short while. So we need a good quality driver in there. I see most amateurs probably have too little loft and too stiff a shaft. We've then got a 3-wood in my bag here. Now, my driver is only 8.5 degrees, which is very, very low lofted for a driver. I then also have a 3-wood that's only at 13.5 degrees, so it's just a few degrees more. Most 3-woods you'd actually see around about 15, 16 degrees, so it's quite a low flight 3-wood. I tend to use that more off the tee than I do off the fairway, and certainly off the fairway. I don't really want it to balloon up into the air. I try and get a nice low penetrating, distance generating flight from there. I then carry a hybrid club. My hybrid club nicely spaced away from my 3-wood. My hybrid club sits at 19 degrees. Again, I can use that off the tee as a kind of a really safe fairway finder. Doesn't go a great deal of distance in comparison to the driver in the 3-wood, but it generally is very, very straight, quite safe. Also occasionally usable off the fairway, trying to generate a lot of distance into a long par 4, second shot into a par 5, or actually used off a tee into a long par 3 as well. So quite a nice, useful addition to the bag there, the hybrid club. Then I have the longest iron. My longest iron I carry now is a 4-iron. Historically would have always been a 3-iron, possibly even a 2-iron in my bag, but recently those have been replaced by the hybrid club. So 4-iron, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Pitching wedge, that's a bit more like the standard set, so 4-iron through to pitching wedge is the standard set. I then have another 3 wedges over and above the pitching wedge. So if we look at the pitching wedge, is a standard pitching wedge around about 48 degrees. I then take my standard sand wedge, which is going to be 56 degrees. So there's an 8-degree gap in the yardages. So 8 degrees is around about 4 yards per degree. So that's going to be equating to a 32-yard gap between those two clubs. Now, most greens are around about 30 yards long. So I could find myself in a position where pitching wedge is going to go over the back of the green, sand wedge is going to lay up too short of the green, and there's a 32-yard space between them. So I could actually plug that gap. So I take myself a 52-degree wedge, what we actually call as a gap wedge, or an approach wedge for some people. So a 52-degree sits in the middle there, and a 60-degree, what we call a lob wedge, sits at the far end. So I now take 4 wedges out into the golf course with me. There's 4 degrees per club space, which equates to 16-yard gaps, 1 to the back of the green, 1 to the middle of the green, and 1 to the front of the green. So depending on pin placements, I'm a lot more options and therefore a lot more accurate with my distance control around the green. Adding that lob wedge in there also gives me the opportunity to hit the flop shot from the side of the green without having to manipulate the golf club too much. And I quite often use the 52-degree wedge from the side of the greens for little bump and run shots that need a little bit of check on them. So these 4 wedges got an awful lot of use, and certainly in comparison to the clubs that I've had to drop out of my bag to put those extra wedges in. Generally speaking, well, actually on the rules we're only allowed to carry 14 clubs, and generally speaking I would encourage you to carry as many clubs as possible. So carrying 14 golf clubs I would think it is a necessity. If you're given an advantage by the rules, take use of that advantage, carry the 14 golf clubs. But I've actually taken out my 5-wood possibly, or my 3-iron possibly, and put in those extra 2 wedges. So I've got a very highly loaded bag at the top end. So I've got lots of options when I'm around the green, because I'll find myself in that position all the time. The longer shots, I tend to find that you don't quite need to be so accurate over your yardages. So I've got no 3-iron, 19-degree hybrid, 23-degree 3-wood, and then an 8.5-degree driver. And that little setup works quite nicely for myself. So what can you learn from my bag, and what could you do slightly differently? Well, I think most people are going to have to carry the driver, I'd also like a lot of people to use a 3-wood, possibly a 5-wood as well. If you find it beneficial to get extra distance from the ground, a 5-wood might go in your bag. And then you've got a few different options. You could also put in a 7-wood that we see quite a lot. Just depends on really the loft that you want to hit the golf ball, the type of grass that you're often playing from, and actually the confidence that you have. Some people would rather look down on a wood shape of head, so a bulbous back and a longer shaft. Other people get put off by those and would much rather use a shorter shaft and a more iron looking head. Now if that's the case, then you could be replacing the 5-wood and the 7-wood possibly with hybrid clubs. But one thing I would really encourage you to try and avoid doing is overusing a 2-iron, 3-iron, 4-iron. And if you find a 1-iron in your bag, you really need to ask a question of why that's in there. You know, most people would struggle to even buy a 1-iron, never mind hit a 1-iron. So let's avoid the 1-irons. 2-irons, 3-irons, and for most people now, 4-irons should probably be out of their bag unless you want a real low ball flight and you use that 4-iron very nicely. If you are struggling a little bit with those shots and you don't get them up in the air very often, take advantage with the technology, use a nice high lofted hybrid club, get that in your bag. The biggest thing you need to do is, rather than just buying them because they look nice or buying them because your mates have got them, is try them out. Take them to the driving range, hit 5 balls with each club and try and work on that yardage gap. Remember what we were talking about with the wedges, trying to find yardages that are nicely spaced apart so each club fits into a different yardage. We need to make sure we can do that when we come to the range or the golf course. The last thing we want is to have 2 golf clubs in the bag that do the same job. So if you say that your 5-iron and your 7-wood go the same distance, for example, drop one of them. Hit 10 balls with one, hit 10 balls with the other. The one that goes most successfully, keep that, drop the other one. If you're looking in your bag and you're thinking, oh well, I've not used that club for a couple of months, that one's really shiny and I never have to clean it, then drop that one out of the bag. Find something else that could go in there. Put an extra wedge in there, put an extra hybrid club in there. Try and carry the maximum 14, but make sure that you're not carrying golf clubs that you've never been using.